Good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm very pleased to be here hosting and chairing this panel. We are a little bit late, so I'm sorry. I'll try to go fast and to reduce also the time of my introduction because it is necessary to end up at 11:30. So we have a terrific panel on a subject that President Mattarella mentioned many times in his introductory speech today, and it was, I think, very important to start with this speech. I would like just to remind the word that President Mattarella reminded us many times: solidarity, solidarity, solidarity. That was the way, I think, the best way to introduce this State of the Union conference. And it is perfect also for us because we are here to discuss about energy transition, first of all, but our discussion on energy transition is based on the word solidarity. And this word solidarity is, we know very well, the fil rouge of all the European integration. This is why the possibility to have a discussion with our panelists and with all the audience is today very useful on a subject that is very, very wide. We know very well that speaking energy transition means to touch many, many different subjects that are territories, regions, subsidiarity, consumers, competition, industrial policies, and of course, also one of the main points, and I end up my introduction with this point, the fact that energy transition means for Europe maybe the most important and the most attractive flag at the world level to clarify the leadership of the European Union in the world on these subjects. Paris climate change agreements and the role of the European Union today on this subject is crucial. It was crucial since the beginning. The founder of the institute that I have the honor to chair in Paris, the Jacques Delors Institute, so Jacques Delors, the mitico Presidente della Commissione Europea, during 10 years, since the beginning, said that the energy union was one of the most important achievements. And this is why the possibility for us to discuss about this flag and this flag towards the rest of the world, I underline another point of President Mattarella's speech today, the Union, not in an inward-looking mood, the Union and the world. And we know very well that energy transition is not just a European subject, it's a world subject, and this world big picture is so crucial. I stop here. We have a terrific panel for this discussion among us. We have the word of the European Parliament, Simona Bonafè, will start. Then we have the word, the possibility to hear important positions by Laurent Schmitt, the Secretary General of the European Network of Transmission System Operators. We have the possibility to hear Frauke Thies, the Executive Director of Smart Energy Europe, so maybe the word of consumers, and it is for us very important to have this opportunity. And last but not least, the European Investment Bank, the possibility to have here Nicola Pochettino. The investment bank is playing a crucial role at the European level. It was always playing a crucial role, but since the Juncker plan 4 years ago, the role of the investment bank is raising. So it will be very interesting for us to hear your points, Nicola. So I stop here. I ask the panelists to really to respect our time constraints, so 5 minutes, no more. I will stop you after 5 minutes. We have to apply European rules, then a small and very fast wrap up, and then we will open the floor to the discussion, because I repeat, we have to go fast. Simona, why don't you start?
So thanks, President Letta, for this introduction. Let me thank for the European University Institute for this invitation to discuss on energy transition, and I will try to take the position of the European Parliament. The focus that this precise panel wants to analyze is very important. It's true that nowadays we are facing in Europe new forms of solidarity that can change, let me say, the perspective of solidarity itself. We are talking here of energy platforms and communities, but in general, we are facing, I would say, thanks to and not because of epochal changement that requires new paradigm in a lot of sectors. I have been rapporteur of the circular economy package just voted in the last plenary in Strasbourg in the parliament. And circular economy means in Nuce to transit from a linear model of growth and development to a circular model with a cultural jump in the way we produce, we consume a product, keeping its value as much as possible in circle. Coming back to energy, we have lived till now in a totally top-down system with customer being only consumer. Today, with renewable energies, we need to change our mind, even in this sector, with bottom-up relationships in which the customer become prosumer. It means citizen, entrepreneur, that produce and self-consume at the same time, and that can even trade the excess energy into the grid. So new energy organization is then required. Less financial incentives to stimulate the market, but more transparency and liberty for consumers to make a choice. So if technologies enable the transformation of the society, may I say finally, a more sustainable society, policy frameworks need to sustain and promote new solutions. As a matter of fact, this debate, today's debate, is taking place at a time when at European level, we are defining a new set of regulation, a new set of legislation on energy that will pave the way for the coming decades and will project us into a new energy dimension. Currently, the European Parliament is involved in negotiation with the Commission and the Council in order to finalize, before the end of the legislature in the next year, new policies on renewable energy, first of all, energy efficiency, electricity market design, and governance on energy union. These legislative files will complete the framework of the energy union strategy launched by the European Commission in 2015. It is worth saying that in the view of many analysts, as President Letta has just said, energy has today the potential to embody the same value for the cohesion of the EU that coal and steel embodied at the time of the founding fathers. Technological innovations and challenges we have ahead encourage us to open the door to an active participation of citizens with direct benefits for them and for the European project. I see two main issues at the core of the union, the energy union. First of all, the need to accelerate the transition to a low-carbon energy system in order to tackle the effects of the climate change. And secondly, the urgency to act in order to guarantee security of energy supply in a continent, our continent, poor in traditional natural resources such as oil and gas. To face both of these challenges, renewable energy combined with energy efficiency represent a key tool that can also have an impact on the problem of the non-competitive cost of energy in Europe. In a long-term perspective, security of supply can be addressed by exploiting at its best natural resources, such as wind and sun, that are not scarce in Europe. At the same time, increasing the production and use of renewable energy is certainly the most effective way to reduce the CO2 emission. This is why the European Parliament calls for a raising of the 2030 targets of renewable energy to 13%. However, what are the conditions to make these objectives an effective reality? And coming to the title of this panel, what role does solidarity play in making this condition happen? Solidarity is essential. And when I think I think solidarity among member states, that through a common governance and an empowered system of interconnections, as President Mattarella said, can create the best conditions for an integrated market, exchanging renewable energies with the required flexibility, but solidarity also among citizens and local communities, that's the point, that through new technologies can finally play an active role as consumers and producers of energy and make their own choices in order to reduce their bill and opt for sustainable solutions. Focusing into energy communities and prosumers, I want to stress that the point is not only their potential to reduce citizens' bills, as we always think of, but also their strategic role in a decentralized system. Technology evolution is going fast. Certainly delays experienced, and I come to the conclusion, on the financial and on the economic side. This is a central aspect, considering that in the last 10 years, the European share of global investment in renewables has dropped from 46% to 17%. If our future energy system will be based on renewables and will be decentralized, thus it can be empowered by a social participation involving civil society and local public organizations. Interacting actors tied in solidarity by common needs and a common long-term perspective can leverage new forces and lead to a general innovation. An energy community can really play a key role on this field. What is certainly is that the Parliament wants to ensure that consumers who produce electricity on their premises are entitled to consume it and install storage systems, and that they can join renewable energy communities without being subject to unjustified conditions or procedures. In conclusion, with all the Energy Union strategy, we think that we have had the possibility to share a strategy and actions that will prove essential in order to ensure our citizens' energy security, economy competitiveness, and environmental sustainability for the future. A concrete proof that for every European, the Union can really change their lives.
Thank you, Simona. I think your point about the role of the European Parliament is the best way to start. The European Parliament is the way to have the voice of the citizens in Europe. And I take also the opportunity to pay tribute to the presence of Enrique Baron Crespo, a great friend and a great president of the European Parliament. Laurent Schmitt, your point of view is crucial now.
So thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me today to speak in front of an audience which is maybe not our traditional audience, being more from the, I would say, business and engineering community side. So transmission system operator are basically a company like Teatro in Italy, represented in all countries, regulated entities, and have the duty of building the physical high voltage system, but also playing an important role in defining how we balance the energy system, how we manage flexibility, and how what are the code for operating the system at a pan-European level. So I'm very happy to be here because solidarity is at the core of the activity of a TSO. TSO experience solidarity every day. Every winter, basically, every country needs its neighbor for going through a peak, and this can happen also during the summer. And what we see is the energy transition does, as what was mentioned before, does require to expand this concept of solidarity further, because if we don't integrate these grids together, I would say it's going to be economically very expensive to reach the objective which we need to reach in the context of the COP21 and energy transition. It is actually a good news the way we see it, because it's a true revolution. I want to highlight this. Some people call it the fourth industrial revolution, some other the 4D revolution. It is a revolution. It is a great opportunity to also give a vision to young generation in Europe of creating jobs in Europe and showing the way in the world on how we are going to achieve this 50 and 70% amount of renewable into the electrical system. This is what we have in front of us. We have not achieved that. I'm confident as engineer, as a committee of engineers, we can do that for the sake of Europe, but also for the sake of creating technology, re-exporting know-how, creating jobs, and all the benefit which goes with it. We are at the edge of this revolution, and what's going to happen is our system is going to turn into what we call in our domain a systems of systems, systems of systems being interconnected. So we already had layers which were pan-European, regional, and country level, and now we see new layers coming more bottom-up from the prosumer, which was mentioned before, this community layer, and is one new layer which we see appearing, and it's, I think, the way we experience it at our transmission system operator level is how to integrate basically the willingness of these people wanting to do things together for various reasons, share flexibility, share renewable, but also use digital tools together, use Facebook, use basically communities, and bring basically this joint initiative to the, I would say, service of the power system. So there is a digital element, of course, which is there, which is to be built on the top of the power system to enable this transaction to happen, and there is a lot of new market design to be created, and we thank the Commission and to have created this wonderful debate about clean energy package. These are sometimes controversial, we don't agree on everything, but it is essential for creating this vision, and if we want to be the flagship of that in Europe, in front of the rest of the world, create job, export, it is essential to be courageous and go to this next step. So in a nutshell, on a TSO and NSOE level, we are ready to take up that challenge. We think it is feasible. We think we need to do it for the sake of the society, for the sake of the technology, job creation, and basically, obviously, decarbonization of our systems.
Thank you, Laurent. I give the floor to Frauke now. Your point about consumers and the presence of consumers in our discussion can be, I think, important now.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, and thank you also very much for the invitation to be here. I should clarify, of course, I hope to be speaking on behalf of consumers as well, but I represent, in fact, businesses working on the energy transition, working with digital decentralized technologies. So behind us is really, business. I was really, really interested, I have to say, when I saw the topic of this panel, because I think it's probably one of the most interesting ones I've seen in the energy field in a long time. And why is that? I think it is because we've for too long seen the energy transition as purely a technical exercise, changing technology. But it is a lot more than that. I think it is a profound change of the way players interact in the energy system, and I think that became very clear both in the intervention by Simona Bonafé and by Laurent Schmitt, that basically we're seeing entirely new trends. And if we look at the prosumer side that was mentioned before, we see people trading with each other, we see people investing in clean technologies, into renewables, sometimes into storage, people unlocking flexibility potentials through demand response, through reacting to price signals that are so essential to make the system work in an efficient manner. And I think this change in how people interact and how people engage in the energy transition is unstoppable as such. And it is great, because we need it so much. Today, it sometimes is seen by regulators as a headache, and it could even become a more profound socioeconomic challenge if the prosumer model is driven by old regulatory incentive structures or is driving into desolidarization instead of further interaction that was mentioned by the previous speakers. Based on the way the regulatory structures are designed in Europe, today the most obvious business model for prosumers is very often to optimize their on-site generation, their flexibility potentials, in order to minimize interaction with the system and therefore benefit from the avoidance of taxes and charges. That doesn't need to be the case at all. In fact, we can make great use of the clean generation and flexibility potentials that the consumers have. And we are seeing great examples out there. We're seeing, for example, consumers in Switzerland working with an aggregator that helps them to both optimize their self-generation and flexibility on-site for their own use, but also takes into account system signals. When does the transmission system operator need flexibility? When might it be better to use the consumer's flexibility to support the system instead of charging up the heat pump from self-generation at times when it's not really needed? So this is just one example. We see virtual power plants popping up, for example, at quite some scale in Germany, where aggregators are putting together renewables, variable renewable generation with storage, with demand response, not only from residential consumers, but in particular also from industrial and commercial loads, to create more stable products for the market. We've seen Finland and Italy making great progress in allowing consumers to receive real-time price signals so they can, very often with help of automation, react to the market and thereby not only save money for themselves, but actually help the system become more stable and save the need for expensive backup capacities that nobody is interested in building anyway. Unfortunately, these business models that I just referred to, in many cases, often are still pioneers and not quite the mainstream yet. And I think that the core challenge here is that we need A, access to the market, and B, the incentive structures to reflect it. And when we talk about access to the markets, I think the clean energy package that is currently being negotiated by the institutions is making a great step forward in the sense of saying markets should be open for everyone, for not only generation, but also demand-side flexibility, storage, decentralized generation in an aggregated way. We need to allow service providers to help consumers market their products. I think we're making great progress here, and I can't wait for the package to be adopted and finally implemented to go further. But probably it is even more than that. As long as we have flat prices, it is very difficult to encourage consumers to participate in the market, and it might be more interesting for them to actually go into grid defection rather than interaction. And that can be driven by oversupply, can be driven by bad market design, and can be driven by flat taxes and charges. And some of these issues are technical and can probably be fixed. But we also need to dare talking about some topics that seemed like taboos so far. Why do taxes on energy have to be based on kilowatt hours? Why don't we base them on the fuel? Or, for example, if I buy a notebook, I pay the notebook not on the taxes on the notebook, not on the number of notebooks I buy, but on the price of my notebook. Why is that different in energy? Why am I distorting the prices by putting it on the volumes instead of the prices? So these are discussions that are extremely touchy to be had because they do have societal implications. But I think if we do not tackle them, we will see an energy transition in which people will rather move into avoidance instead of interaction. So I think we have profound topics to consider. By the way, network charges is another one that's probably even more challenging to get right. And here we need to be cautious to not try to smarten things up and in fact create the wrong solution. But there are some things that are very obvious. For example, allowing distribution system operators to also contract flexibility services from the market and play and work with tariff structures. Final word on this. I think in all of this, it is clear that there is a big transition work still for us to be done in order to create this truly solidarity-based and interactive energy system that will be the most cost-effective and engaging for everyone. While we make this transition, it's very important to not destroy the existing business models that prosumers have, even if today they're based on avoiding taxes and charges, without having the alternative ready and cost-effective yet. So we need to think about the transition pathway because we have something extremely valuable going on here with people investing in participating in the system, in clean solutions. We need to continue making it possible for them while helping them to transition their business model from isolation and autonomization towards interaction and optimization of the system.
Thank you, Frauke. Now the best way to conclude our panel before discussing is to hear the voice of the European Investment Bank. Your role is crucial, so Nicola, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, the European University Institute, for inviting the EIB at this important conference on solidarity. The bank is founded on solidarity of its member state, of the member state of the European Union. And it works to achieve the EU objectives. So it works to achieve solidarity in all fields, and in particular in the fields of energy, where the bank has consistently invested a lot. I am proud to say that, that the bank, although it keeps normally a very low profile worldwide, is by far the largest multilateral development bank in the world, twice as big as the World Bank in terms of volumes, in terms of loans. We are the first issuer of climate action bonds, and by today, still the largest. So there's been a significant contribution of the bank, but in fact of Europe, to the energy transition and to the decarbonization of the economy. Now, President Letta mentioned before the Juncker plan. Maybe I could make a connection between the Juncker plan and solidarity in energy, giving you some concrete examples of how this works. The Juncker plan, is more formally known as the investment plan for Europe, has a number of pillars, or branches. And one that is mostly known is the European Fund for Strategic Investment. It is not a fund, it is a guarantee. And the objective of this guarantee is to help develop, mobilize private investment that might not have happened at the same pace or with to the same extent without such guarantee. So why the Juncker plan has been so important, also in the context of solidarity and in energy solidarity in particular? Let me give you an example, very, very specific and very punctual, so we understand each other a bit better. Let's take one of the most important aspects of solidarity, which is the, let's say, the establishment or the deployment of energy efficiency initiatives throughout Europe. Now, energy efficiency is a very important objective. Actually, the so-called winter package, or clean energy package for all Europeans, puts it at the first place. It's the cleanest form of energy, and it's the cleanest way of using energy, which is not using it at all. The problem here, though, is that there is a market failure. And the Juncker plan, indeed, addresses market failures. There is a market failure because there are several issues. There's a lack of awareness in general on energy efficiency. There is lack of technical ability. There's lack of standards. There are split incentives. You know, I mean, I am a tenant in an apartment, and the owner of the apartment might not be interested in energy efficiency too, because in the end, it's the tenant that pays its energy bill. So this is one of the issue. There's also an issue of subsidized price. Sometimes the prices of heat or electricity might be subsidized locally, and this generates little incentive to go in the direction of energy efficiency. So clearly, for the usual financier, the local banks, it is difficult also to finance energy efficiency. And the reason is also that the single individual or even communities of neighbors might not have the credit status that is needed by the bank to provide long-term tenors and the right pricing. So we have a number of failures that are being addressed by the Juncker plan in the context of solidarity. So what can the EIB do, and what has done so far in this context, and how the Juncker plan plays here? Well, the bank cannot finance directly individuals or even small group of individuals because of the size. I mean, our average, the smallest size of our loans normally is 25 million euros for projects that have to be at least 50 million in size. Therefore, you can imagine that isolating your house or changing your windows is something that costs in the region of 20,000, maybe 25,000 euros. So we are totally disproportionate here. So we need to go to some entities that aggregate the individuals, and we need to offer something that makes it possible to implement the financing, but also technically all the solutions that would help energy savings. So, for example, we are developing, together with the European Commission, an initiative which is called Smart Finance for Smart Buildings. And what does it consist of? Basically, the EIB can finance intermediaries. Intermediaries can be banks, other banks, or can be aggregators of individuals. Could be local energy communities, let's say. And we provide a loan. Let's go to the bank. We provide a loan to the bank. But the bank is still not sure that they want to use our money to finance final users that don't have a credit profile that is appropriate. On top, the banks don't know anything at all about energy efficiency and how to deal with that. So we provide both sides of the package. We provide the financing, and we provide the technical assistance. On top, we lower the risk for the banks. And here is where the Juncker plan comes in. We bring in the funds from the guarantee of the Juncker plan. We can also associate them with the structural funds which are available. This depends locally how these structural funds are used, but could be blended with the EIB loans, but maybe used in a better way than simply as grant. The grant, once is paid, is gone, while we could revolve the use of the structural funds again as another guarantee, what we call a first loss piece, so that if some of the final users that want to implement energy efficiency projects go belly up, let's say, the bank is covered by this first loss piece. On top, what we have experienced, for example, we are providing longer tenors than what the bank could provide. And this is necessary because in energy efficiency, you need to try to associate the saving with the amortizing of the loan. The bank normally tend to offer very short terms, while we want to offer much longer tenors, such as 25 years, so that the savings generated by the energy efficiency during those years can be recovered and pay the loan that is taken by the final individuals. And as I was saying, together with these, we are offering technical assistance. We have teams of engineers and economists that provide directly to banks and to other entities like energy service companies, or could be, as I said again, local energy communities, the knowledge, the technical knowledge, to implement the energy efficiency project. We help them make feasibility studies, prioritizing the needs, doing the preparation of the tenders, etc. Now, with this, I open some topics for discussion. I hope there's some follow-up, some interest on that, but I'm happy to answer to any other question that the audience might pose to me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicola. Before opening the discussion, I would like just to ask our four panelists to answer in 30 seconds to one very simple question. Imagine you have a magic wand in your hands. Next legislature, we will be an important legislature. We will start soon. We are entering soon the electoral campaign for the European Parliament elections. Next legislature will be the first without the UK on board. It will be a crucial legislature for all the European, maybe the most important trends, and energy transition will be, for all the reasons we just mentioned, at the very core of the relationship between the European institutions and the people, the citizens, the entrepreneurs, the SMEs, the real world. And we know very well that Europe needs to have topics to be tied, related with citizens. So we are at the very core of this challenge. So you imagine you have the magic wand, you have the possibility to see realized one big achievement in the next legislature. What is your choice among all the possibilities in this subject in the next 5 years? Frauke, why don't you start? We start from my left.
Okay. You said it's a very simple question. I think it's easier to ask that question than to answer it. But I think if this legislature was about opening the markets for all prosumers and technologies to participate in energy, really, then I would hope that the next one is about having truly cost-reflective incentive structures and signals that reach the market participants, meaning prices on wholesale markets that reflect the value of energy at any given moment, and the possibility for consumers also to receive these signals at the consumer level.
Very good.
So I'm going to disappoint everyone, I think, is I agree with Frauker's...
No, it's not correct. You have to change.
No, I would say write the detail of this market design, of what we all say we need a new market design, what I call the real-time market design, and basically what is the right incentive to give to the various people, being incentive related to real-time balancing flexibility of the system, but not to forget congestion into the system. We are in front of a new economy where we are not going to build infrastructure probably as fast as renewable, and so that's going to change a lot of dynamics behind the pricing. So finalizing that market design, real-time market design, is for me the key.
Well, as you know, the IB is a policy taker, not a policy maker, so I'm more in difficulties. I was going to answer anyway. Let me say, I think that there is, I mean, despite all the efforts, there are two policies. Can I propose two? One is to go even further towards the final consumer. There's a lot of efforts that have been done. Also with this new legislation, I believe that there are some residual market failures that cannot be addressed easily by the policy. And I think further step, I will have to think about what exactly, but let's say one step would be to try to eliminate all the final market failures. And second, I think energy transition goes hand in hand with the decarbonization of the economy. This is a real issue, and we are far away from achieving the targets that have been set in Paris, which are not even ambitious. So I think we are in trouble, but especially I'm thinking of my kids, and I will leave a world that is not as good probably as I found it. And this is what I think we should concentrate on. My colleague later on in a panel on climate action will discuss these issues as well.
I propose 2 issues as well, okay? Now, first of all, it should mean that all the clean energy package that now is under negotiation should be adopted and implemented, and this could be a success on its own. But coming for the 2 issues, the first I would like, my best choice is having interconnections. Of infrastructures between member states, because this means having a really integrated market and reduce the dependence of energy from abroad. And the second is a really sustainable finance that can make the transition happen.
Thank you, Simona. I think we had many interesting issues. We had an important point in the relationship between the profound changes, as Frauke told us in the field, in the subject, related to how to change the way in which we prepare young people to have jobs in the field. That is very clear that it's a completely different challenge. This is why Renault, the role of the universities, university institutions, how to prepare people to be really at the top for this big transformation, and the topic of the skills, I would say the social pact for jobs in this transformation probably is one of the most complicated challenges. I think this challenge is for today, is for tomorrow, but we have to start immediately. I think we both, Renaud, we had in Sciences Po an interesting experience in knowing how the difference between what we taught 20 years ago and today on this subject, and this change is something of really dramatic and I think interesting too. Thomas Pellerin, Carlin et Jean-Arnaud Vinois in this paper presented a point on the social pact, on the energy transition that is, for me, maybe the one of the most important and the most crucial, most difficult challenges for the next legislature. I think we had also a very interesting point on the momentum, because the momentum is important. All policies are important always, but there's a problem of momentum, how to get this momentum. I think the post-Paris climate change agreements is giving the European Union a big momentum on this topic. And also the fact that the post-Trump decision to withdraw was a very important, for me, it was a very, very important asset for the future of European leadership, because the European Union showed a great leadership in the world. Even if the US decided to leave, the Paris climate change agreement are today the true topic. The leadership of the European Union in these agreements is there, and the way also to convince and to share the rest of the world to keep on board, to stay there, to invest. The Chinese, first of all, but not only the Chinese, I think, is the other key issue, very important for the next future. I mentioned a final point before opening the floor is the present discussion on the budget at European level. And I mention this point because I pay tribute to the proposal of the Commission. I think the Commission made a very, very ambitious proposal, and this proposal is ambitious for many reasons. The first reason is the 1.11%. It's ambitious, and it was not expected, and I'm sure that the member states will try to kill this 1.11%. This is why it's very important to support this decision on this proposal on the global amount, but also the internal redistribution. I think it's a sort of revolution. We never had such an internal redistribution on how to allocate the European resources. The fact that we are pushing on all is related to the new world and to new policies, and also policies related to the topics we are talking about today. So I mentioned this point because part of the future of the energy transition is also in the success or the unsuccess of this negotiation. And I mentioned this point because, as Simona said at the beginning, the momentum is important. We are at the end of a crucial legislature, but we will enter a legislature that will be the first one, I repeat, without the UK, and the UK on this subject played a crucial role. And I think the European Union without the UK, for what I think, will be a weaker Europe on this subject. Maybe the European Union will take benefit of Brexit for other subjects. On this subject, I think it will be a weaker union for many reasons. But now we have 30 minutes to discuss, and so I think there's a micro, and I please to present yourself and to present your ideas and your questions, and please on.
Jean-Michel Glachan, Florence School of Regulation, EUI. Would the panel tell what is more likely in the energy sector for the coming digital revolution and rise of platforms? Would the big tech companies take the lion's share, concentrate the value in their hands or wallet? Would it be to the opposite, the consumers who will find new ways of acting, reacting, and taking control of the energy sector? Or would it be, of course, consumers, but only a part of them, the active consumers, so voluntarily engaged into communities, and these ones will be active, reactive, even independent from the rest of the energy sector, or new intermediaries, the aggregators, and will the existing utilities except TSOs disappear?
I take three questions, and then we maybe a first round, and then other questions.
Thank you, Jean-Arnaud Vinois, advisor to the Jacques Delors Institute. Two questions to Laurent Schmitt. One, which is an internal issue for Europe. Interconnections are absolutely key if we want to optimize the resources, particularly the renewable resources of the EU. What are currently the obstacles to this integration? Because I don't see a great voluntarism to integrate more than we are at the moment, when I think there is huge possibilities, and financing is there to finance more interconnections, as we see with a number of subsea cables and so on. So what are the obstacles? And second, which is an external dimension, because no, energy is really the crossroads of all the policies, and here it's about the dependency on external suppliers. We see the Chinese buying transmission of electricity and gas infrastructures in Europe, like REN in Portugal, like in Italy also, and like they did also try to buy the distribution grids in Flanders. What do you think about this kind of attack, which has a major industrial consequence? That state of China grid is at the same time a manufacturer. So that means Siemens, Alstom, and all these big companies out of the market in 5 to 10 years' time.
Enrique Barón Crespo, I'm currently Jean Monnet professor at Personam. Two common questions on market and solidarity. The first one, I'm coming from the Iberian Peninsula, that is an island in Europe, because there is not such a big interest in connections with, historically, I was minister in the Spanish government in the 80s, Till now, it seems that the gas, there will be the connection. So, the Portugal supply is totally from renewable energies. Spain was a pioneer. The current government imposed, for example, a tax with the big groups, Enel among them, on sun that was voted against in the European Parliament. I'm very thankful because to put a tax on the sun is incredible, yeah? This is not only a question of market, it's a question of power of the big groups and a question of the policies of the Union. And the second one is when we talk about supply of energy, especially on gas, there is an obsession looking towards the east. And in the present and in the future, it's very important our connection to Africa. Yeah? There is the Segamo pipeline, gas pipeline, crossing the Iberian Peninsula. There is a connection through Italy. This is very important. We have to take into account that in the future we must connect with Africa, not only talking about people who are coming here, but helping development. I think this is a big priority for the next legislature. A last comment. In Edinburgh, in '93, the agreement on the budget was 127. We are talking about one. There is not a big progress. Thank you.
Thank you for this final remind. I think we can start with these questions. Maybe, I don't know, Laurent, and of course, you can decide if you want to reply or not. Laurent.
Question more directed to...
You choose, but I think the question of Jean Arnaud was directly to you.
Yeah, so it's indeed a complex and a difficult question, so I will try to respond. So first of all, we see very good economical case on interconnection. I think if I may say, the issue is not on the economical and business case side. I think we now have in the PCI a list of profitable projects which are over 150 billion. And I think exchanging with bankers, and there is good appetite into financing these. And the difficulty which we currently see and face are basically the technical implementation of this interconnection and the complexity that related to the fact that some goes through complex environments. And so basically it takes time to build some of them. And the second one, which I'm surprised does not show up too much in the debate for the moment, but which is an hot debate inside the TSO community, is the fact that we start seeing congestion inside the countries, basically reducing the capability of using some of these interconnectors between two countries. And I think, let's be honest, again, it's a market design problem. But we have had, I would say, a certain level of success with our current market design, which is a zonal market, as you know, with flow-based, for those who are technical and expert. And this zonal market assumes that there are infinite grid capacity in every country. And that has been used as an assumption with valid region over time. Because this was the case, the reality is that with the changing flow pattern of renewable, plus the new interconnection, grids in many countries are not copper plate anymore. So that means there are congestion. So that means that we start seeing some of these interconnectors being constrained by physical flows into their countries. So I would say there is a regulatory environment to be created here. And there are, again, a lot of discussion around network codes and how we allocate capacity, manage congestion, and so on, which needs to be fixed. And that's why also I mentioned this market design issue. I think we have a big potato to solve onto that. And if we don't do, I'm afraid it's going to start slowing down investment interconnection. Chinese, big threats, big worry. I'm personally very concerned about that. I spend a lot of my time in trying to minimize my interaction to Chinese state grid China to the bare minimum, because we are in a scenario where we need to balance the fact that yes, China is an important country in the political agenda of the COP21 and so on. But on the other side, I think, and I come from that industry, we should not be naive on the fact that China does this with the purpose to export its technology and be ready with it as soon as the clean energy package will go through. And I think as what US has been doing in the telecom sector with companies like Huawei into blocking some of these participation into some of the sector, I think if Europe is committed to the digital energy transformation, we need to have, I would say, rules in the Commission, Parliament, and so on, which also manage to control strategic participation of China into some of our infrastructure companies. And for the moment, they are just, so that we are not too worried, they are starting to be part of this company. This is below the 20% in most of the case share radar, so they don't exercise real executive steering, if I may say, into this company. But the next step will be to go higher, and we saw a case recently where they tried very hard to go one step further. So my call to the politicians and the Commission would be to please not be naive onto that side. On one side, it's good to have cooperation with these people on the climate agenda. On the other, if we want to create a strong industry in Europe, we need to control what these people does and import in a way into this new economy.
Thank you, Laurent. Who wants to add something? Yes, I ask you to be very short to allow other questions. Frauke.
Thank you. I would like to react to Jean-Michel's question on who's going to be the winner of the energy transition. And as you may not be surprised, I think it fully depends on the regulatory framework. I think if we do not embrace the energy transition and the changes, then probably in the short term, the winners are going to be the large energy companies in the field. Now, in the long term, I think among the stakeholders you mentioned, it would be above all the tech companies and possibly the active consumers, but not all consumers, because they would find their way around somehow. If we do embrace the energy transition and the new realities, really, in the system and continue the pathway that I think is now being started with the clean energy package, then we might create a truly European model of the energy system. And by that I mean a system that is transparent, markets that are open to all players and to diversity, and that are based on interaction. And I think if we have that, then we will actually see much more diverse winners of the energy transition as well. And we will see, for instance, new intermediaries, new service providers from all backgrounds, as well as all consumers benefiting. Because maybe that is a final word on this. If we have a system that is based on interaction, then even if a consumer is not active, he can benefit from the active consumer. If my neighbor engages if Laurent engages in flexibility and sells it to the market, he's not competing with me who's not engaging. He's competing with other generators, other suppliers, and brings the prices down for everyone. And that's what we get in an interactive system where all consumers will benefit.
Thank you. Simona and Nicola.
Yes, shortly, 2 points. First of all, President Crespo is right when he says that connection to Africa is a big priority, and not also for gas supplies, but also for solar energy, for example. I recently hosted in the European Parliament the closing conference of the Mediterranean Transmissions Operator Networks, and there are promising perspective, may I say, on both sides for the future of energy. And the second point, I want to answer the provocation on utilities that will disappear in substance. And if I may say, we are working at the European level, European Parliament, to have positive synergies between utilities and new communities. And I don't see local energy communities as isolated utopian projects. And in this sense, I also think that in a spirit of solidarity, they should participate to the cost, for example, of the grid. So there are a lot of discussion on that, but the provocation is good.
Just a couple of words on the point on the global big tech companies, and then on the interconnectors very briefly. I think the point is absolutely valid, because I had experience in the bank with clients, for example, in the Iberian Peninsula, and these large utilities, they said our competitors are not the other utilities. Our competitors are Google and Amazon. And the reason is that these companies have not only access to an incredible amount of data, but they also have, they're selling tools for energy efficiency that allow the final users to opt for real energy efficiency actions. And an example is very simple. Amazon offers, for each kilowatt hour saved, an amount of money that can be spent on their shop. So now, it seems weird, but it works very well, extremely well in the United States. And this might be a recipe of these companies in Europe as well. I wouldn't be surprised. Then the other problem is that even if we go ahead with policy and regulation, which are absolutely needed, there is a lack of awareness and a lack of ability of the final users of using the tools that he has at his disposal. For example, the smart meters. We have invested in over 85 million of smart meters in Europe. But only recently, only the second generation of smart meters that allow two-way communications and automation can be energy efficient by design. Well, all the rest implies the need for the person to act, and this is far from being automatic. Now, on the point on interconnectors, we are also working on studies, for example, for the Italy-Tunisia interconnector, for the possibility of using renewables possibly generated, like solar, in Tunisia, and then developed to Italy. We are at a market study stage, and the World Bank is involved, and other IFIs. But there is a very nice story on the Iberian Peninsula, for example. It is true it's isolated, but I think a great success was the INELFE interconnector, the Interconnexion Électrique France-Espagne. These doubled the interconnection capacity between the two countries. Now the price differential is lower, but still in Spain is 17 euros per kilowatt hour higher than per megawatt hour higher than in France. More interconnection is needed in this case. On the other hand, interconnection per se is not a given, is not an automatic decision. It should be based on a proper cost and benefit analysis, and some interconnectors might not be needed. Also, if we are going in the direction of more decentralized energy generation, more local energy communities, then we shouldn't oversize the system. This could generate extra costs which are not needed. Thank you.
I saw two questions there, one there and the second here. Please there. 1, 2, and then on this side. I ask you to be really 30-second questions so we can take 4 or 5 questions and then.
Alors, it's a tough challenge, 30 seconds, but thank you very much, Enrico. Markets, markets and solidarity. For a long time, we addressed them by regulating the energy world, regulating markets at EU level for further liberalization. And when it came to solidarity, it was solidarity for the member states. That's what the Delors Commission did till the Barroso II Commission. President Juncker understood that there's a new change in this world, which is the people. Because what we're talking here is solutions for the people. And the momentum you're mentioning is the Future of Europe debate, leading to the May 2019 elections. What will people want as the winning tickets for the future of Europe? And the question is whether energy will be part of that winning ticket. And here, there's still a lot of work to be done. When we designed the clean energy package you mentioned, we called it for all Europeans. But the way we redistribute the benefits of this energy regulation so far is still, of course, with the Juncker plan, investments all around Europe, hopefully, with the MFF, bringing more cohesion, but it's not sufficient. And the new energy solutions you're mentioning, for me, they sound sometimes like the Tesla car, a car that still a few Europeans could afford and even charge. So how could we make sure that these solutions, markets and solidarity, what can be done at European level to have solidarity for the people, because I think that's what we will discuss today, and the link with migration is the same. It's not just solidarity for the country, but also for the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto Zangrandi. I'm Secretary General of EDSO, the Association of Distribution System Operators. Very interesting panel, very interesting quotation. I would like just to remind that you cannot accomplish new forms of markets and above all solidarity neglecting the DSO side. The distribution system operators are those installing and managing the smart meters you have been mentioning, Nicola, and are those updating those systems to make their grids smarter. And the smarter grid allow a better interaction with the TSO, with whom we developed a strong cooperation, and are those that allow to deliver efficiently the flexibility Frauke is representing here. And the future is going towards a kind of interconnection which is not just the one that we have been discussing until now. It is a cross-border distribution trying to improve at its maximum and to exploit at its maximum the potential of a distributed generation, electromobility, and. And the solidarity that is delivered to the citizens before that to the consumer, to the citizens, will be the solidarity that comes from a high efficiency network that will allow lower prices. This is the role of the largest part of those taking the responsibility to distribute electricity.
Thank you. Final question there. Go on.
Thank you. Adrien de Hauteclos, Court of Justice of the European Union and Florence School EUI. Two quick questions. Platforms and communities are part of our energy futures. We see already new forms of markets emerging, but new forms of solidarity, it's less clear to me. So concretely, the local energy communities, how could they contribute to solidarity? I'm following your question. Second question, for the emergence of these platforms and communities, a key aspect is access to data. In particular, if we want tech neutrality, it was mentioned, access to data, data become essential facilities almost in these markets. So should we stay within the general framework of data protection that we have in the European Union, or should we think about something new where maybe there would be a different balance between access and protection?
Thank you very much. I'm so sorry for the other questions, but I was asked to be very sharp in our time. So we have just 1 minute each for our panelists to respond and maybe to say one final word on the future, on the next legislature, the European elections, and the future big challenges. So Simona.
I think that there is one common point in each question that you have made. I think the solutions that the European Parliament has put in place with the clean energy package are not sufficient. I agree, are not sufficient, and we really need to work a lot for solidarity for the people and for lower prices in energy. So a lot of things needs to be done. But one point should be clear. We have changed our mind. With the clean energy package, there's a new vision. There's a, what can I say? There's a new challenge in front of us. And I think that this is a crucial point. We have understood that the challenges of low carbon society and that the challenge of security in supply are for European citizens and lower prices are for European citizens important. And with the clean energy package, we should go ahead to tackle this challenge. But it's true that a lot needs to be done in all sectors.
Yeah, so I think on the question of solidarity to European citizens and so on, I think what is very important to realize is we want to decarbonize the system, and every country has not the same quality of renewables and so on. And I think what we can really bring to the European system is making sure we use at best every renewable, the cheapest which is available, which is offshore, very cheap offshore big production, or very distributed close to the prosumer, or a community of prosumer being developed around a certain city because something happens, whether technology driven or more socially driven, inside this community. So here what we want to achieve is really something which integrates together the fully decentralized one through communities up to the centralized one. And here I think what should drive that integration is really the market design and in the price, and enabling the prosumer to pick basically the cheapest and cleanest energy available into our system. So I think for me it is really a solidarity here.
Thank you, Frauke.
Yeah, briefly on the community and the value for the people, which I think hangs together. So in the community, I think it's a question of what do we understand as a community. And I think the value of a community is that it can help to optimize whether community is local or whether it's just a transversal community of, for instance, storage owners across the country, that they help optimize first between the participants in the community, but it shouldn't be a closed entity. And it shouldn't be a staggered approach of saying first we do this and then we do that. The community can bring these people together, make them feel the value and contribution they have to the system, and act as an intermediary. But for example, and here is also the question of the value and solidarity for the people, make possible what Laurent was just mentioning, to make it possible to balance, for instance, my wind and solar mix, which because of strong wind in the north may be strong in the winter, with the mix in the south that has more wind and solar obviously in the summer, and vice versa. And here it's, I think, really about making it possible not just for countries to trade with one another, not just for large players to trade with one another, but for people, all of them, to directly participate in the system via community, via any other part or intermediary, to help be an active part of the energy transition and benefit from it.
Yes, I would like to tackle the issues of the access to data, and I just wanted to mention that the EIB is making an effort also on the defense and security sector, to the extent possible for the bank, which is basically under three aspects, which is the dual-use research, the physical protection, and cybersecurity. So cybersecurity is an important part because actually their solidarity is essential, because it's not just the protection per se for each individual, but the weaker link has to be tackled as well, where the hackers can enter in any single smart meters or network and jeopardize the full system. So cybersecurity is part of the investment of the bank. But in general, in terms of the energy, let's say, I wouldn't call it policy because I just said that we are not policymaker, but we have a sort of policy in terms of eligibility of energy investment in the bank. We are starting now a review of our energy lending criteria, which will entail a public consultation as well. And each one of you is invited, once this is launched, to participate and provide their comments, not only as institutions, organizations, but also as individuals. It will take place, most likely, the public consultation in the second half of the year. You can follow it on our website. And the new energy lending criteria of the bank will be probably approved by the board of directors mid of 2019. And with this I close. Thanks.
Thank you, Nicola. I think we wrote a fantastic agenda for the next legislature. Now it's just the problem of policymakers, voters, European institutions, but peanuts. What is important is to have in mind a roadmap, an agenda, priorities, and many thanks to the Institute, because the idea to have immediately this point today in the discussion in a very, very crucial point in terms of priority. It was a demonstration of how the idea of this discussion on the State of the Union is an idea towards the future. And the future is on this topic, so many thanks.
May I have your attention, please? Participants for the next session, social investment in the balance, are kindly invited to remain in this room. People attending the parallel sessions, Solidarity and Development, Historical Experiences and Present Concerns with Economic Stability and Political Security Across Borders, are kindly invited to head towards the refettorio. If you need any assistance... Non funziona? Pronto? Test, test. Grazie per avermelo detto. Non è servito a niente allora.
No, non si sentiva.
Eppure l'abbiamo usato prima. Test, test. Sì? Mi senti? Penso che non ha senso più. Grazie per avermelo detto, perché io non mi rendo conto.
No, ma non si sentiva. Vede che c'era qualcosa.
Very welcome. Tu dois relire mes tweets.
Thank you, everybody, for joining the session, Social Investment in the Balance. I kind of believe that social engineering is the human condition, but this is the first time that I ever put together a panel as a blueprint, where the blueprint was in fact realized. So I'm very happy to have Laszlo, Maurizia, Celia, Maria, and Frank here at this table for the next hour and a half. We're going to talk about social investment, basically the idea, the origins, the policy evolution, the way we look at some of the indicators. And then the second tableau of today is about Europe and the euro and the relation to social investment. And in the end, the tough question is the relationship between social investment and the future, or rather the crisis, of European social democracy, the new crisis of European social democracy, because at this table we have all modernizing social democrats who put the social investment agenda forward, and today we know that social democratic parties are not doing very well, and particularly in my country, I think they're down to, 10% of the vote these days. So is there a relationship between the success, in brackets, between social investment and the demise or the uselessness of social democracy today? But before I go to the panelists one by one, let's try to define social investment. And of course, with a nice title like, social investment, what is it? We all have our own sort of inclinations of what that might be. And I have a definition that we don't have to agree on per se, but basically it's about welfare provision that prepares individuals, families, and societies to respond to the changing nature of gendered social risk in advanced economies. And these societies do so by investing, upkeeping, and protecting human capabilities from early childhood to old age, alongside, not instead of, alongside policies that repair social misfortune after moments of economic and personal crisis. So the basic idea is prevention is better than cure. And the kind of background analysis has to do with globalization, has to do with the rise of the knowledge economy, in the sense that social risks of the life course and labor markets have become less predictable and therefore less insurable in a strict actuarial sense. I mean, that's the basis of the old Beveridgean Bismarckian welfare state, that you can actually insure. But the point is that insurance alone cannot guarantee economic security and opportunity in the knowledge economy and aging societies. There's an imperative beyond social security to have something like capacitating solidarity, or what I sometimes call stepping stone solidarity for early childhood, and also second chance solidarity in mid-career. So the social investment perspective is inclusive, life course oriented, future oriented, very gender sensitive in relation to young families, dual earners, employment center, because the basic idea is that the financing of any kind of welfare state goes through employment. And it goes beyond redistribution only. It has this capacitating, stepping stone, second chance solidarity for all side to it. So basically it's countries that invest smartly in human and social capital, but also buffers. They're good in reducing inequality today, and they are more likely to see prolonged, stable, and inclusive economic growth. And this is now the common understanding of the OECD and the World Bank. And I think these ideas were launched by the EU, and as a matter of fact in the late 1990s, and particularly in 2000 with the Lisbon Agenda. And the Lisbon Agenda kind of set the bar for economic success on the basis of employment. It has this sort of line that, we should reach within the next decade a level of 70% of employment participation in the member states. And if you look at this graph, what is really interesting is that countries like Germany, the Netherlands, the UK, Sweden, Finland, I think is also there, I'm not sure. They really are now way beyond the 70%. And the big surprise to me is the US. The US is the one that was, after Sweden, the highest in 1999, and probably even higher than Sweden in the mid-1990s, and has sort of stagnated and fallen behind many of these now more social investment-oriented welfare states. This kind of goes to show that in order to participate in the knowledge economy, a retrenched welfare state or a deregulated labor market is really not good enough to kind of latch on to the new economy. And the other surprise is that the US, in the crisis, we all tend to think that the fiscal policies were far more aggressive in the US and also quantitative easing than Europe. Europe came much later. But still, the decline continues. And if you break it down, you can also show that this is particularly true with female employment. Apparently, females at the low end of the labor market in the US kind of drop out of the labor market, and females at the super rich end of the stratification ladder also decide no longer to work. And this is not the case with these European countries. And the other surprise, well, not a big surprise today, is the massive increase in employment of Germany. And also when you look to the red line, you see that Spain was almost catching up, and then the crisis happened. And the crisis hit Spain tremendously. It's getting better these days. But Italy clearly never really latched on to any kind of social investment orientation in its politics, I guess. And perhaps the same applies to France. So this is sort of, but the employment rates altogether, perhaps we can say it's a glass half full. And I think, this we come back to Maria João Rodrigues, who we all know as Miss Lisbon. She set the agenda and the bar of the 70%. And then 2 years later, Frank van den Broeke kind of took over this thinking on social investment, and he, in the presidency of the Belgian Republic in 2001, the idea was put forward, we should not only think about employment. There's a redistributive element that, needs to be cherished too. And what I take here is children at risk of poverty and social inclusion, because children is really the future of human capital. So in aging societies, if you don't take good care of your children, then clearly, in an aging society, a knowledge economy, and this is, you don't get that kind of stepping stone solidarity that you really need. And here, I would say the glass is half empty. You see that the new member states are really catching up. Bulgaria, Poland, the Czech Republic. The member states hardest hit by the crisis have massive increases in child poverty, going to the level of the US today. And really the only social investment welfare states from this point of view left standing are Denmark, Germany, the Netherlands, Slovenia, Finland, and Sweden. So this is a bit of the picture. And here I would like to start our discussion with Maria João Rodrigues, former Minister of Employment in Portugal. She was really behind the social investment strategy to set the ladder for the 70%. And that was just taken over 2 years later by Frank van den Broeke, who brought in the more redistributive side brought back in the redistributive side of the welfare state, as you can say. So what I'd like to ask the two of you to kind of reflect back, where do you think we stand in terms of, is the glass half full or half empty? And otherwise, where you think this is heading. Of course, we come back to the crisis and the European dimension. And perhaps one other question that I'd like you to ask, I was really struck in the kind of history of social investment that, this was very much developed in the context of presidencies So not in the context of particular countries per se, but in the context of country presidencies that sort of you launch an agenda. So away from the nitty-gritty but politically highly salient welfare reforms that are taking place in all the member states of the EU, but apparently this kind of political space at a distance from national politics allowed you to launch these ideas. I would like you to reflect on that part of the European dimension before I shift to the others. And Frank van der Broeke was Minister of Social Affairs and Employment and Pensions in the Netherlands, in Belgium in the early 2000s. I say the Netherlands because he's now university professor at the University of Amsterdam. So for the next 5 minutes, the floor is yours. Maria.
And then many thanks. And this is really a pleasure to be with these colleagues who were my colleagues of political adventures for many, many years. And of course, I'm also recognizing many faces among the participants. Well, I will reply to your question, but I'd like to put your question in a longer-term context because in my case, as I was playing a role of expert but also politician with the different hats in the Commission, in the Council, and more recently in the European Parliament, I would like to, and now as the rapporteur of the European Pillar of Social Rights, and I'd like to come to this because this is the last chapter of developing European social policy. Let me tell you the steps I can identify from the past until now. I will make a caricature because, of course, I need to be very brief. But my feeling is as simple as that. In the 90s, our main problem was to develop a European social model by ensuring that in the European single market, we could count on a level playing field. And European directives were playing a role in this direction. I remember, as a minister, I was negotiating the first version of the posted work directive. This was our main concern, was to regulate the labor market in the context of single market to ensure the level playing field. By the end of the 90s, a new step was taken by inventing the European Employment Strategy, something I was also involved in as a minister. And the problem there was different. The problem is we, member states, we were recognizing that we were confronted with several common challenges, and that's why we should have a common employment strategy. And we have defined it and we have integrated in the Amsterdam Treaty. And now it is fully integrated as a chapter in the European treaties. When we turned the century, with 2000, what was at stake was to go beyond labor market policies, beyond employment policies, and to deal with the larger range of social policies and their connection with economic policies. And this was the purpose of the so-called Lisbon strategy. It was the first attempt to come up with a comprehensive development strategy for Europe. And so we could elevate the status of many policies, notably social policies. By that time, as Anton is recalling, there was a paradigm shift, in fact, in social sciences, because we are dealing with a new transformation, the so-called knowledge-based economy, and we are understanding that the traditional economics, either neoclassical or Keynesian, were not enough to deal with the situation, and we went to evolutionary and institutional economics as a main guidance. And that's why we put the focus on social investment as the main asset of our societies to deal with this new transformation. The other important point of the paradigm shift was to envisage social policy also as a productive factor. Our arguments, all of us, we were arguing in this direction, showing that social policy is important as such, but also because this is a very effective, might be a very effective productive factor. So these were main arguments underpinning the Lisbon strategy. Then we had the crisis, financial crisis turning into Eurozone crisis, and we are still digesting the outcomes of this. And that's why we are now coming with a new initiative, from my viewpoint, more comprehensive, under the title European Pillar of Social Rights. Well, I prefer to call it European Social Pillar. It's shorter and I think more effective in political terms. And now I will conclude by saying the following. What is new in this initiative? We have a commitment at the highest level. This is the second time happening after the Charter of Fundamental Rights. This happened only the second time with the pillar, the social pillar, proclaimed in Gothenburg. But of course, this is just a start. And the pillar involves legislative instruments, plus redirection of economic and social policies in the framework of the European semester, plus a full range of financial instruments. So we're trying to play with all the toolbox we can play with. Why? And this is my final point. Because, and now perhaps I will be controversial, but Anton gave me the permit, is that what are the challenges we are coping with when inventing a European social model for the 21st century? From my viewpoint, they are the following, and they have implications for the kind of instruments we need to develop. Of course, global competition and the need to move to a knowledge-based economy as our main competitive approach remains fully relevant. And that's why social investment is central. And the social pillar gives a new momentum for this, for sure. But this is not enough, because we are now dealing with another big transformation, even bigger than the previous one, under the current phase of digital revolution, and this will transform completely the way markets operate. Financial markets, product markets, labor markets. When we see this everywhere, in most of the sectors, particularly when we analyze online platforms. And this means that progressive thinking is confronted with the need of updating the way markets are regulated. We need to reinvent, update the way we regulate markets. Not only the financial market, but the labor market. That's why, for instance, the social pillar is saying that whenever we deal with online platforms, we cannot be against this, because this will be everywhere. But we need to make sure that everybody working for online platforms counts on two things: a clear, decent labor contract, and second, full access to social protection, which is not the case now. So updating regulation is a key issue. That's why we need law, European law. And we do have some initiatives. Third point, which is also changing, is the way wealth is being created, added value. And this will bring huge consequences for the way to finance our welfare systems. Once and for all, we can no longer rely only on labor to finance. We need to go to the new sources of added value, particularly in the digital economy. So it's a big change on the way to operate redistribution of income. And fourth challenge I would identify, because we went through the crisis, is the very process of European integration. Because the crisis has shown that European integration, if this is not properly governed, framed, European integration will create major imbalances, major inequalities, will create an engine for divergence, undermining our welfare systems. Which means that we need to reform economic and social governance for the European Union as a whole, and for the Eurozone in particularly, to turn a dynamic of divergence into a dynamic of convergence. And this means to redirect the European semester to make it a real process for upward economic and social convergence. My final point is also in the framework of European integration. That's why, and this is for now, because we just were informed of this a few days ago in the European Parliament when the European Commission came with the proposal for the upcoming community budget and fiscal capacity for the Eurozone. It's as simple as that. Community budget and fiscal capacity for the Eurozone should be realigned with this European social pillar and should provide much larger means for social investment. And three last words to illustrate what I mean is we do need to have in the Eurozone a fiscal capacity enabling member states to keep a good level of social investment. Because otherwise, if we don't meet this condition, we'll have a backlash, a divergence. I can tell you, even referring to the Portuguese case, which is just a half of success and half a failure. Then I will tell you why. Exactly because we don't have the proper means to ensure the necessary level of social investment. So I think we have a full agenda, but I'm pretty confident because we do have some good ideas. A lot depends on checking these ideas and then, let's say, making politics. This is the other part of the story.
Thank you, Maria. And now on to Frank. Frank, I know you I've known you for a very long time, and you are sometimes critical about, the kind of metaphors that I come up with, glass half full or half empty. I mean, how can you really say that? But I mean, after Maria sort of, glass half full with, something to worry about, I'm curious to your views.
Anton, I will answer your question and use the metaphor. So the question is the social investment glass half full or is it half empty? To answer that question, obviously we need a clear definition of social investment. But moreover, I would say the answer depends on the time perspective, but not just the time perspective, but also the site of the action where you're looking. Let me first say just one word on the definition of the concept. Personally, I prefer a rather thin concept, a rather precise concept, rather than a very thick concept which embraces everything. And so when I talk about social investment, I'm basically talking about policies geared to developing human capital over the life course and policies that work on the conditions to do that in an effective way. And so there are other social policies, income protection, insurance, that I do not conflate with social investment, that I think are complementary, because I like to work with thin and precise concepts. But then the time perspective. If you take a very long time perspective, I would say that there is a lot of water in the glass. And this is shown by the first graph by Anton. You look at employment, and notably female employment, and you see a considerable progress, which is clearly associated with the number of policies that we see as social investment policies in the long term. And I think you could, if you go into the detail, if you look, for instance, at education, and you take the PISA results, what you see in the EU 28 is a kind of positive upward convergence in PISA results, with countries that were lagging behind in, say, the first PISA tests 2000 in 2003. Countries that were lagging behind are catching up in terms of educational outcomes. So that's a kind of progress. And obviously, if you define education more in formal terms, that is at attainment levels, you see considerable change in a positive sense in terms of educational attainment. And so the long-term view, there is a lot of water in the glass. Now, you might say, yeah, but this is about endogenous developments that were linked to deindustrialization and feminization of labor markets. No, I would say there is also policy. To take two examples, we might come back to these examples. If you take Germany and Poland, two important member states, first of all, in terms of numbers of people, if you look at educational outcomes in Germany and Poland, they are improving clearly, and it's partly the result of important public investment in education, both in Germany and Poland, which is in contrast with what happened in a number of other countries, but also deliberate reform in the education systems. And that policy, these are policy choices, and they do produce something. So the long-term perspective, there's a lot of water in the glass, I would say. Let me then to kind of a medium-term perspective that is looking at, say, the past 10 years, but not just looking at the past 10 years, but looking at the EU as the site of political action. And I might start with something I published together with Anton and Bruno Pallier already 7 years ago. We published a paper saying, the title was, "The EU Needs a Social Investment Pact." In that paper, we explained that it was about investing in human capital, but that there was also a complementarity necessary with income protection, insurance, etc. So we were not saying it was an easy panacea. But basically, the message was we need a social investment pact for the EU. This was the time of the competitiveness pact, etc. And happily, Laszlo then took over, in a sense, by launching the social investment package in 2013. Now, obviously, a package is not a pact. The idea we had in mind, and I'm not saying this to criticize Andor, but to explain what the idea was a kind of reciprocity. The idea was all EU member states should commit themselves to social investment. That implies reform. It sometimes is difficult reform, notably for member states that are in dire budgetary straits. And so those member states should also be supported. And so there should be a kind of support in reform. It should be a kind of a contract where the EU is a player. It asks member states for reform in the social investment direction, but it should also add tangible support to make it possible. Now, if you ask me, from that perspective, which is not a very long-term perspective, which is taking the last 10 years, but also looking at the EU as the site of action, I would say the glass is pretty empty. Why do I say this? Well, first of all, and we might come back because you want another round on austerity, there's been a number of interesting reports. The European Social Policy Network published a report in 2015 on social investment. The conclusion on what happened during the years of crisis and austerity is pretty negative in terms of what happened not in all the member states, but in most of the member states. childcare, investment in childcare, investment in education, a number of other services. These were the casualties of austerity. I won't go into detail, we can come back to that. There was an interesting report published in the same year, 2015, by the OECD. They looked at 9 countries and simply at tax and benefit system changes. The conclusion of the OECD was that then, 2015, looking back at austerity packages, in 8 of the 9 countries, Germany was the exception. It's interesting, Germany was the exception, but in 8 of the 9 countries, the policies were clearly less favorable, to put it mildly, for families with children than for other families, which obviously is not on the social investment page, to say the least. Huh? And then the idea, I think, which Laszlo certainly also tried to support with the package, the idea that you would go into a kind of a compact whereby there would be tangible support for countries that were in budgetary difficulty but that wanted to pursue social investment reform. I think we didn't do that at EU level, that's clear. That idea was kind of floated from time to time, but it did not materialize. And so, why do I say this? Because it did have some consequences. What we've seen, coming back to social investment indicators over those years, is rather than having this steady upward convergence, which is part of the picture in the long term, and which is the picture between, let's say, the new member states, most of the new member states, and the core of Europe, we did see new divergence. In the book published by Anton on the uses of social investment, I have a graph, which you might criticize the graph, but you might say that's simplistic, but it shows that between, say, 2006, 2008 on one hand, and 2013, public investment in education was reduced dramatically in some countries, like Romania, but not only Romania, also Hungary. Whilst it increased spectacularly in Poland and Germany. And so there was a new divergence in terms of investment in education that was pretty spectacular, which obviously announces later divergence. I'm not saying here that good education means spending a lot of money. I've been Minister of Education. I've told my audiences hundreds of times that it's not just about spending money. But obviously the opposite is not true either. Huh? The opposite is not true either. And so over the crisis there was a huge divergence in terms of investment in education. And you see that the kind of long-term upward convergence, which is there in educational outcomes and in childcare development, it had a shock. It had a shock during the years of austerity. And so the fact that the EU did not answer this call to be a real player in terms of social investment support was consequential, I would say. Now let me just a final word on the second graph, which Anton, I think, very usefully has shown with child poverty and social exclusion. I think it speaks for itself, and Anton already commented upon it. But here I would like to make maybe kind of a self-critical remark for people who have been in this social investment advocacy like I have been. Obviously, what the graph shows is very much the result of the Eurozone crisis. You see Greece, you see Italy on this graph. Huh? What it shows is obviously the shock of the crisis in terms of standards of living, notably also for families with children, and loss of employment for families with children. That's what it shows. Now, the shock of the crisis, we had a session on the monetary union just before. The shock of this crisis is partly our own making, because we didn't have shock absorbers that were ready. In other words, we didn't have insurance mechanisms. And here, let me put this in a bit of self-critical way. I think many people, and not just right-wing economists, but also social investment advocates, as I was and still am. Huh? But we underestimated the need for insurance devices, the need for stabilization devices. You need that. Otherwise, your social investment story is loose. Now, my argument today is that you need that. First of all, in the discussion on the Eurozone, a monetary union must be a true insurance union, and it's still incomplete. But it has a corollary. You also need it in the member states of the monetary union in terms of how their welfare states functions, which means that unemployment insurance, the adequate unemployment insurance, is a key issue as a shock absorber. Now, I think we are now becoming aware of this, but there was a tendency in the social investment advocacy to say, oh, social insurance is out of date. It's an old story. I think that's a mistake. That's a real mistake. And so I think the intellectual but also the political challenge today is to find the good combination of stabilizing devices, social insurance devices, adequate unemployment insurance on the one hand, and then this capacitating investment policies on the other hand. We might come back to this because I think that also speaks to the political difficulty of social democrats, notably, because they need both. It's about stability and security, the message of social democrats, also. But so I think, looking back, answering your question, if you look at long-term developments, country per country, there's a lot of water in the glass. And I would say it's not just endogenous, spontaneous developments that led to more childcare and educational improvement. It's also policies. Take Poland, take Germany. If you take a more kind of medium-term perspective and you concentrate on the EU as the site of action, the glass is empty. If you think about what went wrong, we should be a little bit self-critical. Social investment cannot be the only game in town. You need insurance mechanisms, and you need the good combination of the two.
Frank, it's almost like you're saying we need a thick concept of social investment.
We need several thin concepts. I would say.
Anyway, I think you already touched upon. I would say is the elephant in the room, which is the social investment idea was indeed launched in the context of European presidency and the Commission, and this continues until today with the social pillar. So the EU is the social investment cheerleader in the world, one might say. But on the other hand, what we have seen ever since 2010 and onwards is the EU or the European Commission and the European Central Bank as the fiscal austerity headmaster. And I think this is no surprise because, I mean, the single market and EMU, they were launched, on the basis of the memory of the stagflation crisis in the 1970s and 1980s. So in the constitution of EMU, the Stability and Growth Pact and what have you, I mean, it's all about, keeping these national welfare states in check. So, that's why we have these rules. And then to sort of open up another panorama, that's great when, the tide is up. But when the tide is down, then the reflex is austerity. And, amidst that reflex, that's when Laszlo Andor, as commissioner under Barroso, launched the social investment package. And yes, we were kind of disappointed. It was a package and not a pact. But, this was probably the most right-wing commission in history. And still, there is the social investment package. And if you read the documents, I mean, this is pretty progressive, given its limits. So I would like Laszlo to sort of answer to Frank as the auctor intellectualis of the social investment package and how he saw his role. And and what is left of it today, and what can be done, Laszlo.
Yes, thank you very much. It is really a pleasure to be part of this discussion among so many friends. Indeed, I should speak about the time of crisis, which was indeed at the European level a period of agony. And I can speak about it until the end of my life because it's such a daunting experience, especially from the point of view of social policy making. But this was really an ambivalent time because despite the crisis, in this portfolio, in this area of expertise, people around the world were looking at Europe with envy. Even the World Bank at the same time was describing Europe, the European Union, as a lifestyle great power and appreciating the achievements of the European post-war welfare state and also the more recent additions like the Lisbon strategy and the European employment strategy, kind of initial steps of a European role in this area. But at the same time, what you felt and what you went through was a kind of apocalypse. The apocalypse of social Europe, and not because of one reason, but for the four horsemen, obviously. You already had, for a few decades, globalization, and it was challenging the stability of employment and the stability of finance, which is a material base for welfare systems as well. You had the EMU, which colleagues already pointed to, starting to erode and undermine the welfare systems, maybe not everywhere, definitely on the Eurozone periphery. You had the enlargement of the European Union, which in a way internalized the social dumping which globalization and global competition otherwise represents, and brought in some characters into the European territory who are not really committed to the European social model and the concept of the social rights. And finally, you also have as a fourth horseman on the horizon, digitalization and automation, bringing a lot of additional flexibility and representing a threat to full employment and social safety nets. So you have not one, but at least these four factors, and bringing a perspective of decline rather than some kind of revival. But what can you do at the time of crisis? Of course, you have to confront these perspectives and see where reform is possible in the short run and what kind of innovations can be brought in order to ensure that once the acute phase of the crisis is over, there can be some kind of counter initiative or counter offensive. And this is exactly the famous social investment package from February 2013, and I can only recommend it to any student of social policy or the history of social policy, because it's indeed a very comprehensive European document in this area. But let me state very, very clearly that this document could not have been produced without external help. The Commission staff alone would not have been able to produce this document. Colleagues at the table and several others provided analytical, intellectual input and guidance to this work, which was hugely appreciated. And that's why, in a way, the social investment package was a success among the stakeholders. In fact, I can say that it was already a success among the ministers well before it was written. So 6 months before, when it was just announced in the summer of 2012, when Mario Draghi was announcing something else, I was telling the ministers that we're going to present a social investment package. This news alone already provided some kind of relief and consolation to people who were at the time the most desperate in the European Union, which was the social affairs ministers, who were completely armless and helpless in the fight against the consequences of a devastating financial crisis. There were also many misconceptions. I mean, we have been speaking about, in a way, the flexibility of this concept, but there were also total misconceptions. Let me just mention this as a kind of footnote to the story. The day before I went out to present the social investment package, one of the Brussels newspapers published an article that the Commission is going to outsource social policy to Goldman Sachs, because for them investment was linked to financial investment, and actually in some countries there was a period of experience with social impact investment and bringing in financial investors and somehow watch what is the social outcome of this. So there were, and probably there are still, misconceptions around this phrase. The content, some of you might be familiar with it. At the heart of this, there was a recommendation on child poverty, there was a document on homelessness, there was advice about EU funds being used in favor of or in support of the social economy in various member states. There was a report on active inclusion, and there was also a launch for a campaign on minimum income schemes and how the Commission would advise member states who want to establish minimum income schemes. And I heard more recently that even Greece was a country which started to develop a scheme like that as a result of this. So at such time, you have to try to innovate, and even if the crisis brings a huge amount of limitations, it shouldn't be a mental limitation, right? So there can be space for innovative thinking on minimum income, on unemployment benefit schemes, which was discussed in the previous session on the EMU, or, for example, the youth guarantee, which is about youth education, employment, and mobility at the same time with European support. And also, more recently, the youth guarantee turned out a kind of inspiration for another concept, which is called the child guarantee, how to ensure that a kind of package of social support and services can be designed across member states, and the EU could play some kind of harmonizing role in this area. So the political decisions this required was twofold. Number one, that you have to clarify that even if there is a big crisis, the welfare states should not withdraw, but they should be upgraded. And upgraded in the sense of having some very good pioneering examples already in the European Union, and you try to multiply this good experience which exists in a few countries. And the other one is to confront the notion, sometimes it's a kind of cliche, that social policy would be a matter of subsidiarity in the European Union, and no role should be played in the area of policy coordination when it comes to the social questions. So you do need coordination of social policy, and on a practical level this meant including social policy in the European semester. And there are some colleagues, Jonathan Zeitlin, Bart van Herk, who have been measuring this, how more and more social content appeared in the so-called European semester, but also, similarly crucially, the integration of these concerns in the EU budget and help through financial support, but also stimulus when it needs to be built up newly. Now, whether this is half full or half empty, let me answer in 3 points. Number one, with any kind of innovation, the question is, what stays after the emergency is over? And I think after the crisis is over, because it's more or less over in the European economy, not without consequences, but let's say there is no acute crisis at this stage, and there is always a temptation to go back to the comfort zone, to go back to the pre-crisis interpretation. And in this respect, the point of attraction is the concept of the social rights. Now, I appreciate everything Maria said about the European pillar of the social rights, but social rights as such is the 1989 version of European social policy, which is exactly the time when Mr. Juncker was employment minister in Luxembourg, and that's exactly what he remembers as the cornerstone of the European social model. But two things happened in the meantime. What happened in the meantime? The EMU was established, so now we have a minimalist and not very well-functioning monetary union, and that needs to be linked to the social model. And the second one is the Eastern enlargement, which also creates a completely new context for many things. So there is a kind of risk factor because of the post-crisis nature. And if you look at the EMU side, I would be inclined to agree with Frank that it's almost empty because we published the communication on the social dimension of the EMU in 2013, which brought in a scoreboard, which was more recently revived and extended. But if you only have a scoreboard against the divergences inside the monetary union, you can only measure, but not necessarily counteract the divergence, which is a massive problem. And then on the East-West question, I also believe that maybe we can have a half success. I mean, you should know that the country with the lowest poverty rate in the European Union is the Czech Republic. So there's some decent performers in the Eastern Bloc maintaining resilient systems as well as the political commitment. But there are also other extremes, like Hungary, where Mr. Orbán cuts back the unemployment insurance to 90 days, which is really unprecedented in any civilized country, and practically destroyed much of the welfare state, in fact making social dumping an economic strategy rather than social investment. So this is, again, let's say the half-full nature. I think there are countries where this concept gained traction, and there might be a kind of limited capacity, but the intention is there, and the drive is there to go to this direction, and I think we need to strongly engage where this concept is not understood, because if the social dumping remains a kind of economic strategy, like at this time in Hungary, this will also mean that the imbalances which destabilize the European Union will continue to function in an uncontrollable way and represent a high risk also in the future.
Thank you. Thank you. So I think it's about time we shift to the politics of it all, and I think there's nobody better as an astute observer of social Europe than Maurizio Ferreira from the University of Milan, and he's actually one of the first cohorts of graduates from this place, from the EUI. And as a matter of fact, the EUI played, an important role in, I think, setting the social investment agenda, because I remember 20 years ago, Maurizio and Martin Rhodes organized a year-long seminar series on recasting the welfare state, and I was invited to a couple of these events. And one weekend, there were policymakers from all over Europe, discussing the kind of results that we were presenting. And at some point, I can't remember exactly when, but it must have been 98, people from the Portuguese ministry came to Maurizio and they asked Maurizio, can you guys write a report on the future of social Europe? And then Maurizio and Martin got in touch with me, and we wrote this report for the Portuguese presidency. And then when the social summit was organized in Lisbon, people from the ministry again asked us, who should we invite, to comment on the document? And there was a young minister of social affairs in Belgium who we thought should be invited, and he made a huge impression. And then a year later, Frank van der Broeke called me up in the summer of 2000. Yeah, he's saying, look, we have the presidency in Belgium, in 2001, and can you advise me on where where to take, this kind of work that you've been doing. And, I had a conversation with Frank saying, you can think of Colin Crouch, or you can think of Gösta Esping Andersen, you can think of Fritz Scharf, and then, but if you want to do something imaginative, for the 21st century, a new architecture, then I think, Gösta should be the one to write, and Gösta was a professor here as well, and so we got in touch with Gösta, and, and that's how this pamphlet came about, why we need a new welfare state. And I think, the role in the background of EUI, has been pretty important. But the question I would like to point to ask Mauricio, I mean, there's on social investment, on social policy, there's always been a fight, let's say, between DG ECFIN and DG Employment. But in the wake of the crisis, I mean, the cleavages are changing. And it looks like that the cleavage is much more along country lines. Philip Genschel and I just wrote a little paper on solidarity in Europe based on the YouGov survey. And we were really, really struck by the fact that, in fact, the German public, by and large, kind of supports the Eurovision of Macron. But the French are really true supporters of the financial ministry, whoever runs it in Germany. And it's sort of like, so the way forward, I mean, it's no longer necessary to convince DG ECFIN, I don't think. But the cleavage that has been created by the crisis, the fault line, I mean, how can we overcome that? I mean, it's a big political question, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. I will answer to your question, but I would like to start with some very general propositions, and I hope you don't find them too abstract. The first general proposition is that politics is centered on institutions. The second premise is that institutions are mind-dependent entities. So they crucially depend on our possibility to think about them. And only if we think about them in a clear and recognizable way do we feel, to some extent, obliged or encouraged to comply with their normativity, with their deontology. And for an institution to exist and be effective as a mind-dependent entity, it must have a name. It must have a name. A name that makes the institution immediately recognizable to the eyes of the public, to the eyes of its own addressees. And what needs to be recognizable is, of course, the broad mission of the institution, but also the instruments, the set of instruments on which such broad mission rests. Now, I think that a major problem that we have when we talk about the social face of Europe is the following. We don't have a name to call it. On the one hand, we have the economic and monetary union. Everybody now knows very well what that is. It has institutions, the ECB, ECOFIN, it has pacts, it has rules which have a tangible effect on people's life chances. We don't have a counterpart. We talk about, and several of these names have been mentioned before, we have the European social model. We talk about social Europe. We talk about the social dimension. What are they? What is there behind those names? And it's not that with mind-dependent entities, it's not like roses, to paraphrase Shakespeare. They need a recognizable name, a proper name. They don't smell as sweet if they don't have one particular name. They don't smell at all, actually. So I see the experience of the European Union in the last 10 years. We have mentioned strategies, we have mentioned various programs, and now I'll come to social investment. We have made a number of efforts to designate in a coherent and systematic way what we sense needs to be established, needs to be there, because we have EMU, and there is a gap in the social sphere. But none of these expressions, none of these names, none of these symbols, because names are also symbols, have been effective. Take social investment, okay? What is social investment as an entity? It's essentially an idea, a set of propositions that had to do with causality about social reality, that had to do with normative principles. But what is behind this idea? There's a package. But what is a package? The package is in fact a document. A document which, because of its legal status, never got to have hands and legs to actually walk and, to some extent, bite in empirical reality. It didn't make any inroads into real politics. The communication came out in 2013. During the next year, the following year's European elections, according to analysis of party manifestos, no European party family ever mentioned this expression, save for the Green Party, I think, in their manifesto. So it was totally unused and unexploited to speak to the European public at large. Then it suffered, I think, in 2015, at the very beginning of the new Commission, it remained victim of what I would call the fallacy or the trap of hasty expectations. Reports were made in which, academics and experts started to say, well, nothing is really happening. It's not going to be, it's not being a success. In particular, I remind the report from this policy unit of the European Commission that dismissed it as a notion that had not been able to have any political buy-in on the side of governments and other actors. And there was a group of experts that analyzed the reforms in the member states and concluded that even in those countries, whether some shifts had actually taken place in terms of institutional innovations in the direction of social investment, in national debates, there was hardly any reference or mention to this symbol. So the symbol remained totally empty and totally ineffective, even in the relatively limited but not negligible causal power that political symbols can have in directing policy change. So it was dismissed, the new Commission came in and probably had a wish to differentiate itself from the previous Commission. So it started to soft pedal the notion of social investment, even if it had been there for just a couple of years. And already after a couple of years, it had been assessed as a failure. Things take time. And then a new series of efforts at naming started. And the first exercise came out with a totally awkward, in my view, expression, that of a AAA Europe.
Social AAA.
Social AAA Europe, which had not only the shortcoming of being a totally empty shell, but that it also connected social Europe to rating exercises and rating agencies which certainly were and are not trusted and certainly not loved by European citizens. Then the new entry is the European Pillar of Social Rights. Now, I am a little bit more optimistic about the symbolic and possibly the political purchase of this new entity. The idea behind it, it has a content. And the content is the enumeration, the formalized enumeration of a list of rights, precisely. They're not very new. They basically are the standard rights of the European welfare state as it developed in the second half of the 20th century. Some are, let's say, bent towards social investment, children, women, gender. So there is, a certain advancement in respect of traditional enumerated lists of social rights. And it also has the advantage of connecting this new entity with the language of citizenship, which is, as you know, highly entrenched in the European tradition. So it resonates immediately with the expectations, with the cognitions, and also with the, let's say, the affections of European citizens. Now, the risk that is obviously there when you speak about rights is that they remain just aspirational and that they are not equipped with biting tools. And there are already, critiques and kind of pessimism on the side of people that say it's just cheap talk once more. Phrase mongering, it's not going to make any difference. Well, this is true only if you forget that rights are not only legal guarantees. They do not only empower individuals with enforcement resources. They have two other additional properties. First, they are norms, they are principles that create or have the potential of creating spontaneous deontologies. Just because there is a norm, people can refer to such norms to underpin and justify their claims. And maybe the European Union will be able to use this normative potential of the pillar in forcing reluctant member states to maybe align themselves with not only with the letter, but also with the spirit of the list. But there's a second additional component, which has to do with the material resources or instrumental resources that all rights necessitate to being actually exercised. A legal guarantee does not empower you de facto into the exercise of a right. You have a right of free healthcare, but if there's no healthcare facility where you live, how do you exercise practically your right? So it's normally, the authority that has originated or emanated the right that has the duty to also see to it that there is in place this material infrastructure for the exercise of right. But here, I think that the European Union can play a very important role in upholding and also offering additional resources, guidance, steering and leadership in upgrading the infrastructures that are necessary for a full realization and actualization of the pillars of the right, especially some rights which have to do with capacitation, because capacitation needs services. We repeat it all the time. Services are costly. They need to be funded. They need to be organized on the ground, okay? And the EU has a limited budget, but it has a budget, and the budget can be mobilized more in a more targeted way for offering and providing to the pillar the capacity to create the conditions or better conditions for the exercise of right. Let us not forget that many of these rights that have to do with services are materialized at the local level. So the actors are the regions, are municipalities, and also non-state actors. In fact, one of the novelties, still a little bit invisible, but one of the great novelties of social protection in the European Union, social promotion, whatever you want to call it, in the last decade during the crisis, is the profusion of local level initiatives initiated and organized by public and non-public actors that have brought financial resources, that have brought expertise, that have been very helpful in the actual delivery and production of services. I have a project that is studying this in the Italian case, and we are really, Anton knows about it, we are really surprised about how much movement there is on the ground. So why not take this into consideration and connect it more explicitly with the pillar and use the notion of right to push the Commission into focusing its activities and its role into this third component of the concept of right, which is conditions for the actual exercise of right. A final message. The European Pillar of Social Rights is a better name than the other ones. It's not an empty shell and has a potential for biting. It is not enough. We need a more ambitious, much more ambitious and comprehensive name that is capable of giving rise, of creating an entity at the same level of the European economic and monetary union. We need a European social union as a symbolic and then an institutional counterpart for the economic and monetary union, a union that has, on the one hand, some distinctive features. Some of them are national, some of them are transnational, some of them are supranational, and that overlaps to some extent with economic and monetary union when we talk about European level shock absorbers, unemployment insurance. What are they? They are at the same time part, or they should be part, of the European social union and of the economic and monetary union, because they serve precisely the objective of making the economic and monetary union more effective and therefore more capable on delivering on its own logic, but also prevent or help the economic and monetary union not to generate negative externalities on social Europe, whatever it is. Thank you.
I've used that one. Use that. Thanks. Like this, I think. I would now like to bring in a little bit of Greek tragedy. Because, I mean, if I were to summarize all of what you've said, then basically say the glass is just half full and there is potential. But there is this tragedy going on because, I mean, the political actors that set the social investment, that develop these ideas for the social union and what have you, they're all modernizing social democrats, from Tony Blair to Frank van den Broeke to Laszlo to Maria. And when we look at the fate of social democracy today, and then even this picture is not the right one, because this doesn't include the German election, the French elections, and the Dutch elections of last year. So, I mean, we're way back to 1900 on European social democracy. So there is a puzzle. I mean, on the one hand, you can say, you know, maybe social democrats are just being squeezed. You know, there's the right-wing populists, they now defend the welfare state more than ever for, you know, only the whites in the room. And then you have the left-wing populists who say, we've never, you know, trusted the globalizing platform of the European Union. And of course, the Christian Democrats in my country, the Netherlands, but also Germany, have basically taken over these capacitating policies for families. That's sort of one part of the story. But the other part of the story is that as social democrats modernized the welfare state, they basically did it by stealth. They did it in a way by, you know, they did invest in children and family, but the rhetoric was, you know, this is what we do to save your pension. So it was still about the old welfare state. You do the new thing to defend the old. And there was never any attempt, I think just Esping-Anderson's chapter in the Why We Need a New Welfare State book was the only one, that actually said, you know, we need an assertive, inclusive life course perspective from the young to the old. And this is, I mean, for me, this is a puzzle that, you know, the policies are out there, the evidence is pretty good, but the narrative was never, ever there. And so that's my puzzle that I would like to pose to Silja Hausemann, who's a professor of political science in Zurich, in Switzerland. She was an ex-Max Weber scholar here. And a long time ago, 10 years ago, a friend of mine sent me a manuscript to look at for, I was editing a series on changing welfare states in the Netherlands. And the book really swept me off my feet, and I got in touch with Silja, but she had already been offered a contract with Cambridge University Press, and that's much better. So, you know, I had, you know, she had an offer she couldn't refuse, and now the mic is... Silja.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll try to be, yes, very brief. I take up this challenge to speak about social democracy and social investment very briefly to you. Anton asks, why hasn't social investment, why hasn't social democracy embraced social investment more decidedly, more enthusiastically? Why hasn't it become the main programmatic focus when it comes to social policy? And I think there are two factors which explain this, one related to electoral transformations of social democracy, and the other one to the change in the fiscal context. And I will briefly explain why I think those two factors matter. But I think before saying why they matter, we have to understand what they matter for. And I think the question that social democratic parties face when they decide on what issues to emphasize in their electoral manifestos, etc., the question is more complicated than just saying whether they support or reject social investment. That would be an easy question. Mm-hmm. I think no party would really, no social democratic party would really argue against the goals and ambitions of social investment. But when you look at it more closely on what can really be proposed in terms of social policy, you have, I would say, at least 5 viable potential options for social democratic parties to go. One is the kind of encompassing universal social investment agenda that we discuss here, meaning you invest in both working class and middle class, children and working age people in order to reach these goals of social inclusion and economic prosperity at the same time. But when you look around Europe, you see other forms of social investment that you could call partial social investment that are implemented in several countries. For instance, if you invest, if you spend more on childcare structures, on incentives for education, and you do this in an optional, voluntary way, we know by now quite clearly that middle-class voters are the ones mainly benefiting from these policies. So you can do a kind of a middle-class social investment. It's still social investment, but it's a little less inclusive. Or you can target social investment towards lower income social groups and do kind of a working class social investment. And that, of course, is also then loses part of the universalistic and ambition of social investment. But even beyond social investment, there are other possible strategies that social democratic parties could take. One of them I would call social protectionism, meaning defending the achievement of the income protection welfare state that they have been so important in building up. And that's different from investing. And the final one hasn't gained so much ground yet, but is emerging in many countries, which you could call a sort of a no-growth welfare state strategy. Arguing in terms of universal basic income, for instance, that you have to loosen the link, not strengthen the link between employment and social policy, but you have to cut this link because of automation, digitization, there may not be enough employment to serve as a basis for social rights. So when social democracy has to make up or has to decide programmatically, this is the menu they have to consider. And it's not a surprise that it's very hard for these parties to make these decisions on what to emphasize among these options for these two reasons. So the first reason, electoral transformation. This idea of the mainstream left or social democracy slowly dying is wrong. What we see electorally with the mainstream left and social democratic parties is rather a process of substitution of their electorate from a working class electorate to a middle class electorate. In previous work with Jane Gingrich, we have been able to show that even in the early 80s, on average in Europe, 2/3 of the social democratic voters were working class, 1/3 middle class. By now, it's completely the opposite. The ratio is completely inverse. 2/3 middle class, 1/3 working class. So now the electorate of these parties is very different. You have on the one hand the more educated, more female, new middle class electorate, but still also strong roots and ties to the old working class. And these two groups want very different things when it comes to social investment. Not least because they are on polar opposite when it comes to the socio-cultural dimension of political competition, which opposes openness, cultural liberalism to traditionalism and the protection of national identity. And if you want an example to picture this, think back to the last French presidential election where you had Macron and Mélenchon appealing to mainstream left voters with completely opposite programs, one based on openness and investment and liberalism, and the other one on protectionism. And the official socialist candidate, Hamon, squeezed in the middle, trying to find a middle ground. So this conflict between different groups in the electorate of a party in the past was dealt by giving to all of them, giving social protection to the workers, social investment to the middle class, and the second reason why it has become difficult for social democratic parties is that this has become much more difficult in a fiscally constrained context, to just give to everyone in order to create this broad agreement on a strategy. It has become more difficult for fiscal reasons, but also for political reasons. Today, if you want to expand massively in education or childcare, it has either the opportunity cost of not investing in the pensions, or it has a direct cost of reallocating funds from one to the other. I mean, that is debatable, but if we buy into the assumption that the budget is not expanding ad libitum, then you face a problem of trade-offs, at least in terms of opportunity costs, maybe even in terms of direct costs. And that creates a very, very difficult situation for these parties. So to answer your question, if we ask why hasn't social democracy become the champion of social investment, I think it's important to stress it's not because of bad leadership or unfortunate communication or because of a lack of idea or a lack of understanding of what the issues at stake are and what sound policies would be. It's because of politics. Different social groups want different things. And that is the reason why, or maybe even beyond wanting different things, they prioritize different things. And that may be the reason why not all modernizing social democrats nowadays mobilize within the social democratic parties. And increasingly, we have to divide the parties from the idea. But I don't see how the social democratic parties in this situation could make a sharp decision in favor of one strategy rather than another one.
Thank you so much, Celia. I have a question to the audience. Are you hungry? And I hope not. I mean, I hope not for the next 10 minutes, because I think we really had a very interesting conversation, and it would really be a shame if we do not allow the panelists to kind of reflect on only one point of the other, just to, you know, to trigger your minds, you know, as you go for lunch. So that's what I would suggest. I mean, the original idea is also to have, you know, a Q&A session, but I think the richness of the conversation at this table, you know, we should sort of like, you know, tease out a little bit more of that, and then, you know, hopefully we can meet over lunch and ask ourselves, ask each other questions. So, and I do it in the same order as we started. So I begin with Maria and then Frank and others. Maria, short, take out one point, one lesson, if you want, from the conversation that we're having.
I will start from Celia's comment on the reasons why we can have this so-called decline of social democracy, and then to connect to the other statements. Look, and again, of course, now we need to be telegraphic, but it is true that social democrats, they are losing some of their electorates. Basically, the young, educated people, they can move to Macron type of parties, while the traditional working class is moving to nationalistic, xenophobic parties. And social democrats, they seem more left with the middle class around public services and so on. So the question is, how can they regain initiative and coping with the larger electorates? And my idea is very simple. They need to do two things. Is to update the policies agenda and to change the way they make politics. I start with the last one because I really think that social democracy has reached a moment in history where it is no longer possible to implement a social democratic agenda in the country alone. A precondition to implement a social democratic agenda at national level is to change the European framework. So which means that social democrats, they need to work to change the European framework. Otherwise, they can no longer implement their agenda. European scale matters. And of course, it's very difficult to implement a social investment strategy if the framework is pushing for austerity, just to give an example. So they need to change this. Second point, updating the policy agenda. And I think Anton is completely right. Social investment should be used not only to promote a new way to safeguard the rights of the past, example, those who have a pension, and they want to have this pension sustainable, so they want to have social investment and having more young people in employment, fundamentally because they want to finance their pensions. This is too limited. And we need to work with a larger concept of fairness. And starting with children, and then young people. Which means that this is a paradigm shift in favor of sustainability, meaning fairness between generations. So these paradigm shifts needs to operate in the way to renew the social democratic agenda, and we are halfway. Some parties don't understand this, they just keep their role of defending the past rights. They will disappear, I think.
Okay, thanks.
That's it.
Thanks. Maria, Frank.
Let me first note in passing that I think that Laszlo's been very kind in a way for the new Commission. I think it was a real mistake by the Commission not to keep the social investment package really on board. They should have done that. And they didn't, for the very traditional political reason that you want a new vocabulary, but sometimes an institution like the Commission should also care for continuity and build on continuity. This being said, I agree with Celia, Anton. The problem with Social Democrats was not that they did not invest in the narrative. I invested heavily in the narrative when I was minister between 1999 and 2003 of social affairs, first of all, by launching this concept, active welfare state, by explaining that it was different from the Giddens stories and the third way. So, and I invested heavily in it. But obviously, there are dividing lines among social democrats that make it difficult. I remember very well the first time I was in a debate on my notion of active welfare state with not only my party, but also my French-speaking sister party, the Parti Socialiste. A very senior, I won't say, very senior PS ex-minister and politician, which I regard highly, immediately said, "Je déteste cette notion. Je déteste cette notion." And then, why is that? Well, indeed, because for that person, this was insufficiently about protection. And there is a kind of difficulty which you should address in your communication, but which is not easy to address. The fundamental difficulty is the following. The social investment narrative comes across as saying, your security depends on the success of our investment in you. So your security, basically, it's in you. We'll do our utmost, but it's you. It's your skills, your adaptability, your blah, blah, blah. Huh? Whilst the traditional social democratic narrative is, your security is collective action that is independent from you. And luckily, it is independent from you. It is collective action. This is different. This is different. Now, you can square it, and I've tried to do that. First of all, social investment also depends on collective action, services, social profit. It also depends, as Maurizio said, it's also about collective action. Huh? But the difficulty is pretty real. Let me just add a footnote here, and then I'll keep my mouth shut. I think we could have done better in terms of communication, and to give one example, I think one of the failures of the old Lisbon narrative about skills and education is that it came across as elitist, because it set targets for tertiary education and etc., which are important per se. But I, for one, quite rapidly started talking in a different way about education. We don't need, you shouldn't say when you come on television, we need a high-skilled society. It means nothing for most of the people that vote for you. They are not high-skilled. You should say we need a well-skilled society. The most rewarding things I did as a minister were training schemes for domestic cleaners. Training scheme, and they need it, they need training. Training schemes for coaches on buses with children. And I said we need a well-skilled society. The cleaner also needs skills. It's a decent job, and it's not such an easy job as you might think. So that's a very different twist, which you can try to give in the narrative, but nevertheless there is a pretty fundamental tension, and that tension is not solvable simply by narrative. It depends on political choices. You should try to combine it. But there are dividing lines there. And that's one of the reasons why I think that we need a pretty precise concept of social investment that should not be too thick. And we need to combine it with other concepts. And the whole of those concepts, also the more traditional insurance idea and the more traditional security idea, should be part and parcel of what Maurizio called the European Social Union.
Well, I think the essence of the paradigm which we discuss here is that good social policy can also be very good economics. And I think whether this philosophy makes headway or not should not be purely measured by the repetition or non-repetition of the expression social investment, but whether the components like a youth guarantee or a child guarantee appear or not. And they do appear, so I think the paradigm is making some progress. For example, 5 years ago, a European platform for investing in children was launched, and this cannot be evaluated after a few months. It takes a longer time to see whether such initiatives are making progress or making a difference or not. For social democracy, let's just stop beating around the bush. I think there are some hobby horses and obsessions, like the discussion on the posted workers. And thanks to very strong trade union influence on the leadership of the Social Democratic Group, these obsessions, of course, keep coming back whenever there is an election, and then the new elements, even if they could be very important, are often sidelined. So this is pretty much what happened also in 2014, even if there is very little mileage in a new debate on posted workers. Some people prioritize it as opposed to other issues which would need to be more topical. Finally, on the social investment package, I think one thing is still missing from the explanation, that this was proposed in order to support the implementation of the Europe 2020 strategy, which expressed a European commitment to reduce poverty. And of course, if a Commission steps back from this ambition to reduce poverty in the European Union, there is no need for the supportive packages like the social investment package or the Roma integration framework. I mean, all these are not middle-class issues. These are issues targeted to also using European Social Fund for social policy purposes. But I think the point is that this withdrawal from the poverty reduction commitment was decided in 2014. It was camouflaged in many ways, like the social AAA and all this rhetoric. But the question is whether the European Union can return to this ambition to reduce poverty in a measurable way. And this cannot happen without reviving also the social investment paradigm.
Yeah, just two remarks on the Italian situation, which quite clearly illustrate the syndrome that was, outlined by Celia and partly also by Maria. The PD, the Democratic Party, campaigned with a platform, with a program. Very few people read it, but I did, which was clearly as social investment oriented as it was possible in the Italian context. It was really, and it even included the objective of establishing of a European social union, which I kind of suggested them. Okay, why was this program not persuasive at all? The presence of two populist, competing populist parties, but essentially for two reasons. The first one is that the platform of the PD internalized the MU constraints. So it was the party that actually promised or announced that it would spend less than everybody else, 38 billion euros. That means about 1/4 of what the other two parties were promising to spend. And it indicated the funds that were going to be used in order to cover the 38 millions. Second thing, they said, okay, we are going to comply with the MU constraints, but we are going to push for a more socially friendly Europe. We are going to change Europe and make it more social. Well, the voters did not buy that at all, because that's what Renzi had been saying for 3 or 4 years. You know, and I don't know about Monti, but Renzi had repeatedly say, I'm going to Europe and try to make it more, more flexible, more capable of, upholding investments in the social policies, and he did not deliver. He was unable to deliver. So my conclusion is, if there's no transnational coalition among social democratic parties, which I think is extremely unlikely and very, very, very unlikely, with the involvement of the trade unions and some other interest groups, because democracy is not just voters and parties. There's society in between. And society does make some difference, right? Organized society, I mean. So if that doesn't happen, in addition to all the elements that Celia so clearly stated, we are not going anywhere as social democrats.
Okay, on that happy note, but not so, we have to call it a day, and we have to have our lunch, but I think there's lots of room for discussion and thinking. Thanks to you all for staying so long, and thanks to the panelists.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me? May I have your attention, please? So this concludes the morning session, and we will now break for lunch, which will be available in the lower loggia, which is close to the cloister. Lunch will be followed at 2:30 by the live streaming of the plenary session Solidarity in Europe, Achieving Authenticity in the European Street, by the President of Ireland, Michael Higgins. So if you need any help, please ask any of our staff members. And enjoy your meal.
Very interesting.
Great discussion. Great. It's too bad we didn't get the debate, but. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's very good. Very good.